We're now going to talk about measurement. Measurement is defined as the process of observing and recording observations as part of a research effort. Measurement is central to science, and measurement is particularly hard to do in the social sciences. The reason for it is that most of what we measure in the social sciences tend to be cognitive, affective, and implied processes that lead to human behavior. Most of these cognitive, affective, and implied processes are very difficult to measure because they're happening internal to individuals or as an outcome of some kind of group activity. Measurement, therefore, is important, it's hard, and it's central to good research. Talk about measurement, we begin by talking about it in terms of measurement validity. In other words, the validity of a measure or a measurement procedure. So we're going to begin by talking about construct validity. Construct validity is the approximate truth of the conclusion that your operationalization accurately reflects the construct. Remember, operationalization is the conversion of a construct to its measure. So if you took SAT scores as an operationalization of intelligence, the question of construct validity is how good is the SAT at measuring intelligence. Here's an example of a scale. It's called the West Side Test Anxiety Scale. This scale is an operationalization of test-taking anxiety. It is a 10-item scale. What I mean by 10 item is it's got 10 questions. Each question or each item is rated on a 1 to 5 scale. 1 to 5 being 1, not at all or never true, to 5, extremely or always true. The way people take the scale is they answer each individual question, they sum up the answers to each question, and then they divide it by 10. So it's the average of your scores, your test anxiety score. If you do have the time and you're so inclined, please go ahead and answer these questions, and then you can where your test anxiety is, where your mean test anxiety rates on this particular metric. All right, so let's use this example and work with it to understand construct validity. So when we deal with measurement validity, the first question we ask is a simple question of translation validity. Translation validity is simply defined as whether or not the operationalization is a good translation of the construct. This is a very low standard that we apply to see whether the items in our scale in some way translate to the construct in the most appropriate manner. First things first, you could look at something called face validity. Face validity, quite simply, is does the measure or the items, in this case the 10-item scale of test anxiety, in some way, in your judgment, do they appear to be measuring the items that students would go through when they are anxious about taking a test? It is a rather weak form because it merely uses judgment, individual or researcher judgment. Related to that kind of validity, another form of translation validity called content validity. Here you check the measure against some content domain. What is a content domain? The idea of test anxiety comes from a domain of ideas. Test taking, anxiety, test outcomes, how well you did in the test, which is assessments. And so you can check to see, again, using your judgment, whether or not the items, in your opinion, translate to tapping into these concepts that reflect test-taking anxiety. All right, so these are two judgment-based processes that help you establish some level of construct validity. Now, the next one is what is criterion-related validity. Here, rather than just using a judgment call, we start checking the measure against some relevant criterion. Now, the next form of construct validity, or next test of construct validity, are criterion-related validity. In criterion-related validity, we move away from using pure judgment to a much more rigorous criteria, and that is an empirical criteria. And what does that mean? What that means is you actually take the measure and you measure something with it and test to see whether the measure is doing what it's supposed to be doing using real subjects, real data. The form of this is what is called as predictive validity. Predictive basically says, does the measure predict something it should be able to predict? Right? For instance, a test-taking anxiety scale should predict people's performance in the test. People who have low anxiety should probably do better than the people who have very high test anxiety. So you can use the measure to go to a one-on-one class, for instance, give the test out, and look to see how well the people did in their exam and compare the two. Another form of validity The next form of validity is what is called as concurrent validity. Concurrent validity is a type of criterion-related validity that tests whether or not the scale distinguishes between groups that it should theoretically distinguish between. So for instance, a test anxiety scale should be able to distinguish between, let's say, people who have high social anxiety versus those who have low social anxiety, assuming that test anxiety is somehow related to social anxiety. So in this way, you can test to see different levels of construct validity.